Hi there, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'd like to talk to you about the Gospel Book of Otto III and what we can learn about Ottonian symbolism from this beautiful and very lavishly illustrated book. The Gospel Book of Otto III was created at about 1000 for the young Emperor Otto III, and it is currently in Munich. It is one of the most beautifully illustrated books that we still have surviving from the Ottonian period, and it is absolutely full of illustrations. As you can guess from the title, it is a gospel book, and is full of illustrations of the Gospels, including the activities of Christ and his disciples, and his family members like Mary. Now, if we start looking at this picture, there are a few things that we can immediately see about it. For one thing, the folks in this illustration do not look like your average Renaissance illustration of a person. They are flattened, they're schematized. As you can see, we have lines here rather than really in-depth folds or any sort of realistic drapery, but that's not going to be important to the people that are actually looking at this book and studying this book. What's going to be important to them is the symbolism, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, coming at this from the point of view of someone who may have never seen anything like this before, or may not at least recognize it off of hand, we need to start with the very basics. What we have here is clearly a scene that's been split up into two parts. We have the top scene here with the gentleman making a gesture towards a woman surrounded by other folks and a guy off to the side here. And then we have a bottom scene with someone with a sword, and off to the right we have two women who are together. And what is this in the middle? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's start with the top scene. What we can tell about this top scene right away is that this fellow here is a king. He's wearing a crown. He has a very beautifully decorated outfit on here. We have embroidery. We have a little clasp up here at the shoulder. This is a cloak, and underneath it he has a fairly tight-fitting garment. So we can assume that this fellow, and he's also actually a little bit bigger than the rest of the characters here. So he's a king. We have a woman in a very beautiful dress with, these are pearls, these little white dots are pearls, probably rubies, gold, and an underdress, and she's depicted in torsion here. Her body is turning to the side. Unlike any of the other characters here, you may notice they're all rather static, except for this one young lady here. He's gesturing to her, and at the same time he's holding his bread knife or fish knife. He's obviously getting ready to eat. We have two pieces of bread here on this upturned table and a fish sort of happily sitting there in a bowl. This fellow over here is offering this bowl of possibly wine to the folks at the table, which indicates, and also from his very plain clothing, that he's probably a servant. A king gesturing to a woman, and she may have a crown on here as well, which if she does have, she's removing. So the clue here is that we're looking at the Gospels, and what we have to do is go through our knowledge of the Gospels and think about what situation that this might reflect. A woman dancing before a king only occurs one time in the New Testament, and that is in the case of Salome. If you're not familiar with the story, Salome is Herod's niece. Herod's the king, and he's, during the time of Jesus' young adulthood, in power. He's a very, I suppose, debauched king for the time period. He has done a couple of very sketchy things in his family, taken his brother's wife and killed his brother off, and he's been actually getting confronted about it by John the Baptist, who you probably recognize as Jesus' cousin and the fellow that baptizes him. John the Baptist has been talking to Herod about his sins, and Herod has actually been listening to him and feeling rather bad about himself. As you can imagine, this doesn't go over too well with Herod's wife, Herodias, and she's not very happy about John the Baptist, and actually sees him as basically the root of her problems. So what has happened is that Herodias instructs Salome to go and dance before Herod during one of his big banquets, which we assume is attended by some fairly high-ranking officials, and you can see that they have a more elegant style of dress than the servant over here, so these are probably officials. And he's trying to impress them, obviously, with his table, although it's not as lavish here as it's indicated to be in the New Testament. So in the middle of his big dinner, Salome comes in and begins to dance, and she's such a good dancer that Herod, who's a bit in his cups at this point, says, well, you know, you've danced so well, I'll give you whatever you want, and the typical up to half of my kingdom is appended here. And she says, I'll take the head of John the Baptist. So he has to do it, because he said he would do it, and he's the king, and, you know, he can't go back on his word, which is unfortunate for John, but that's kind of how it goes when you're a saint. So here we have the situation of him telling Salome that he'll give her whatever she wants, up to half his kingdom. She's in the midst of her dance, which is really beautifully depicted here. And then we get the split. Ottonians did this all the time. This is a very, very convenient way to depict the scriptures without taking up an entire page. And it's very easy to recognize. You see here there's a very clear ground line and then more of this gold background, which, by the way, implies that this whole thing is happening in sort of a spiritual space rather than on this temporal earth, which also is one of the reasons that these people are so geometrical rather than illusionistic, because they're not really intended to be you and me, they're intended to be these sort of iconic figures. Anyhow, as we can guess, this is the top is the first half of the story, the second half is here on the bottom. The upshot of her beautiful dance is that this fellow, who's an executioner, you can see he's drawing his sword, cuts off John the Baptist's head. This is poor John leaning over. He's been imprisoned in the castle. As you can see here, the castle is cut off rather oddly around the bottom. That's because the gold is filling in for the unimportant details of the terrain, like rocks, which would normally be here. So, as you can see, he's cut off John the Baptist's head. He's either... And this could be that he hasn't done it yet, because he's placed to the left and therefore prior to this, or it could be that he's already done it and has cleaned his sword already and is putting it away. But in any case, executioner, dead John, and the final scene, which is Salome, who has now changed out of her over-tunic, which had the gold fancy things on it, into a slightly plainer, but still purple tunic, is handing her mother, Herodias, the head of John the Baptist, who is sitting here sadly in this little bowl, and Herodias is here graciously accepting it and talking to Salome. That's what this pointing finger generally means, that someone's talking. So what we have here is a very complicated scene that can become uncomplicated simply by the process of elimination. Once you've discovered, oh, there's only one scenario in the New Testament that calls to mind a dancing woman and a king, you can narrow it down to a specific incident. You can also do this from the surrounding text sometimes, although some of the gospel books that are produced by the Ottonians put the pictures in where they don't have anything to do with the surrounding text, they just sort of go in there. But in this case, it would be pretty close to the actual story. And if you couldn't tell from the king and the dancing princess here, you could also tell from the beheading, which only occurs to John in the midst of a story. I believe it's mentioned that it happens to James, but it doesn't show up in an illustrated, verbally illustrated in the New Testament. But the ladies with the head in a bowl, any number of these things could serve as your first clue. And from there you can extrapolate to the rest of the details of the story. And it's very helpful if you do this to pull up a copy of the Vulgate or even your King James Version is fine, whatever you're using, next to the picture, and go through and try to match the details of exactly what's happening in the scene so that you can understand where these illuminators are getting their ideas from.